the so-called water. So this is a very vague differentiation. Um, river, waters. This is only guides the mind slightly to see what Heraclitus is getting at. But anyway, so we're at Jaspers, and Jaspers is saying, here's my version of Dasein, where Da is more like the so-called waters or the changing thing, and Sein is more like the Suke or the inner realm. Sometimes if you read Aristotle, you see this. The usage is, when Aristotle's not specifically analyzing the Suke or the psyche or the soul, but he's simply, in his animal books, he's simply talking about a region. Just Fusus is a region, the Suke is a region, and basically the distinction is things like, in the Suke we can count and say this is 1, this is 1, 1 plus 1 is 2, and so on. But in nature there's no such obvious, empirically there's no such obvious distinction, because you need to apply that standard like a ruler and say there's a pure 1 and then try to get things to match up to it, because in reality if you see a tomato or something, two of them are precisely identical, so they could say 1 plus 1 is exactly 2. It's only in the Suke that happens. In nature, in Fusus, that doesn't happen. So you have, or at least that's how it appears to the tradition. So you have 2,400 years like that, where there's a distinction between something like this Newtonian notion of the philosophy, the natural philosophy or philosophy of nature, which Jaspers makes a great point of differentiating between, but I won't say anything about that. But and something like the investigation of nature by the senses, the so-called natural history or biology, as it's become. In Jaspers, we get this Greifung, I think he calls it, this sort of grabbing, this total grabbing of the two into one, and then he speaks of the kind of a traditional notion which he projects back into all of human experience of transcendence, which he thinks belongs to all the mystics who realize that they have a Umwelt experience, an experience of what, according to Jaspers, everyone experiences as the same, although, of course, once we look at that in the lens of Galileo, and Locke is the most famous for the qualitative difference, for the differences between the primary and the secondary qualities, where color is the most obvious example. Let's say dogs probably seeing something like black and white. And then he's realized that the Umwelt, the environment, is not exactly the same for all, but Jaspers thinks about it as though it were the same for everyone, because he thinks for the Germanish it's like this, for the whether why he does that is because he's thinking for the normal case it's like that. The normal case is color vision. Then there's the abnormal or defective case of non-color vision. The normal case is 2 arms and 2 legs. The defective case is 1 arm and 2 legs, or 1 arm and 1 leg, or whatever. If you're thinking in normative terms, then it's kind of easy to say, yeah, the Umwelt is what everyone has alike. And then there's the second thing that corresponds to the Suke or the soul, which for him is the other part of Dasein, which is that we're there and we have a specific, unrepeatable perspective. We're seeing what we're seeing. Nobody else but I at this very moment is seeing both these tomatoes here. Nobody else is even seeing these tomatoes. Nobody else is seeing these tomatoes and the tomatoes again on the screen, etc. We have our own specific observation of things. We're an adjective in that sense. If adjectives observe things rather than describe them, if adjectives observe or describe rather than modify them. we observe and describe things in our way that is because we're positioned in this position and nobody else is us. We do it that way. But according to Jaspers, everyone's in the same Umwelt or environment, doing that according to their unrepeatable and singular position. Just once, just this time, etc. So this is his version of Dasein, and it leads to a kind of notion of transcendence. This version of Dasein is already an update on earlier ones, on Hegelian and Kantian and other versions, as I indicated earlier. So then on the other side of, to remind ourselves, Heidegger and Jaspers were close. Heidegger had some kind of ideal of the philosophic friendship, which he thought about in terms of Count York, and I think I'm not sure who Count York was supposed to have had close contact with, maybe, but I can only think of Dilthey as close to York's view that we are our history. Although that's not really Dilthey's view, so I'm getting a little bit, but those are in the same. Dilthey and Count York are both in the earlier generation before Jaspers, that kind of led up to Jaspers and then led up to Heidegger, is what I'm trying to, I guess what I'm grabbing as ready-made there. On the other hand, we can compare Heidegger's version of Dasein to Kierkegaard, Søren Kierkegaard, who is engaged in this Auseinandersetzung, this verbal confrontation, this dialogic discussion with Hegel in a deep way. And so, because Hegel wants to synthesize the Physis and Suke, but Kierkegaard wants to bring something more like a perfect, the most perfect grasp of the night of pure faith, to Knight, night, like a knight in shining armor, night of pure faith, to this problem of the bringing together of the two regions into something like a Tao-like perfect vague, a post-enlightenment sort of enlightenment to this Freud shown Gottesfunken, this divine spark, but a divine spark which isn't a divine spark necessarily for everyone, but for the authentic one who has, of their own forces, of the inner responsibility, come to this understanding, so that they're no longer alienated in this way. That Hölderlin's letter, when he says that the Germans are basically totally alienated from, they're totally opposite of the ancient Greeks, who are their fountainhead. The ancient Greeks spoke a theory all the time, but they really lived in the waters, they were placed in the action, in the region of violence and change, whereas the Germans, no matter how violent their actuality was, they lived in the total suke. So from out of this position of becoming aware that this had occurred over the Western history, Kierkegaard tries to present a case for his version of Dasein. It's in this hugging these positions that Heidegger is formulating his version of Dasein, which is a kind of ultimate attempt to no longer be, since we're now aware that there's these positions that can structure us like this historically, Heidegger is saying, even though I'm still moving in this kind of position, my event or Ereignis is that I've branded the Western Dasein with this possibility of looking at the position. What this Ereignis in Heidegger means, something that we would normally consider original, but I know Heidegger speaks of originary, appears in such a way that it's kind of saved and conserved and rescued by each one that keeps going and talking to Heidegger, having a conversation with Heidegger, and keeping it alive. And it's something that was not seen before because it's part of the essence of the Western path, if you like. The Western, let's just say the fate or the history of being of the Western Dasein. So from within this notion that the Ereignis can be grasped as a kind of awareness of what the history is, Heidegger is saying, I have these and these commitments, and this is sort of my categories, except he calls it existential. So these are, because he's moving from Kant and Hegel and so on, from Plato, Aristotle, to this position, which is, I just showed more closely with the Jaspers and the Kierkegaard version. He's moving to, as it were, the most originary glance he can give under the conditions he's in. But under those conditions, he doesn't say, this is why it's very important to see Heidegger is not a historicist, as according to his own self-understanding. Even though Leo Strauss, because Leo Strauss has a commitment to the Platonic beginning and to the distinction between the historicist and the non-historicist, between the nihilists and the people who believe in agathon and in aletheia and in truth. He has to see Heidegger in this light, more like the light of the difference between the Epicureans and the Aristotelians, or something along those lines. But or the Platonics, maybe, to be more in direct opposition. Heidegger's position is not, it's so aware of all the tropes, of all the things that it could fall into and not have freed itself, that it doesn't just take its position from the Kierkegaardian type of position of an ultimate breakdown of the inner and outer realms in the Night Appear Faith, or in a kind of something that goes beyond Pascal's idea of imitation of Christ, as Christ is the one who has the most reason to be prideful because he's God, and the most reason to be humble because he's a pathetic human being subordinated by the whole culture. This in the Night Appear Faith as something more like a Taoist position, a non-moral position, super-moral position. We see in one part of Heidegger all kinds of subtle nuances which should be thoroughly studied and with the exacting comprehension be brought out, be given expression to. But at the same time, we have, beside from that in Heidegger, the being and beings, Spaltung, or this so-called ontological difference, but understood in a very specific way. So that's understood. I just point to it in a bare way is Zizek. What he kind of does, I think, is he thinks of people like Durkheim, who have explicitly said, I'm a transcendentalist in this post-metaphysical sense, and that I'm no longer concerned with the juxtaposition with the a priori on the one side and the constructivists on the other side. This notion that, for instance, if physics is the real stuff, it means that we have to say um, the a priori of pure numbers is a reality, is a non-empirical reality standing behind all realities, so that the physics can, so far as physics is understood as reality, is that which is measurable and quantifiable in maths, in the Pythagorean Platonic sense. If one can't do that, then there's no a priori structuring of numbers in the universe. So numbers could not be regarded as, numbers would have to be regarded as something that, let's say, somehow were constructed by a specific form of being, not necessarily an animal, but some specific form of being in the stream of time came up with the, maybe not consciously came up with it, maybe it evolved and just appeared before it, which seems to be the case for all of us. We have numbers just show up there. But were they something that just showed up for a specific kind of being, and then it can use it to draw lines around the whole universe and present the universe in the symbolic form of numbers, which you think of those idiotic Matrix movies with the phony computer code in green going on the computer or whatever. It's like something like that would have to be the Archimedean point, which stood back behind the world and was the giving, the Galilean notion of the language of the universe is math. So there'd have to be this genuine language which somehow has always existed, which didn't just arise with a human being. So then the other version historically is that there's some kind of construction, somehow this language came into being, it's useful to a certain kind of being, it's useful to a certain extent, but how can it be called? There's no warrant for saying this is the ultimate reality. Then Durkheim comes along and says, okay, but I have this third option, which is this cultural transcendentalism, and I'm the real transcendentalist. And this, I think this is in a certain way the way Zizek thinks of Heidegger as a super transcendentalist, more like Durkheim. So again, that's inadequate for understanding how Heidegger's thinking of the ontic-ontological difference, but in order to grasp how he's thinking about it, we have to read very closely what Heidegger says about that. For instance, in the second book on Schelling, I think the second thing Heidegger wrote on Schelling, he talks quite a bit about how he does that.